Okay.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning, wherever you are. This is the fifth webinar on India that the CESPI Observatory has organized. And today we have the honor to have as guest speaker Francisca Liesotte Onsorge, who is the chief economist for Asia and the Pacific at the World Bank. She has worked in other institutions, including the IMF, where I had also the honor to meet her, and we shared the mission. We were in the same mission together many years ago. She will talk about trade as catalyst for India development. So in a way, we continue a discussion that we started a couple of webinars ago. And Francisca's presentation will be discussed by Partha Sen, who is member of our steering committee, and an honorable professor at the University of Delhi. And then, as usually, but for the ones that join this series only today for the first time, after these two, presentation and discussion, we open for discussion, and that will invite you to post your questions and comment eventually in the Q&A box, so we can pick them up, and then this will make the discussion possibly alive and even more interesting. So, Francisca, the floor is yours. Please make your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. And now's the time to talk about trade. It seems that a topic that had been a bit forgotten has now come right back up front and center. So I'm very pleased to talk about it, especially in the context of India. India has, you may have heard, has set itself this ambitious goal of becoming a high-income country by the 100th anniversary of independence, so 2047. That means, that's a number that's much discussed, no? It would mean growing at 8% every year, all the way until then, for the next 22 years. So that's not impossible, but it would require a big growth acceleration, because currently India is growing, over the last 25 years, it's been growing about 6.5% a year. What I'm trying to convince you today is that trade may just be that catalyst that is needed to generate this growth acceleration, especially in the current environment. So I go through three questions. The growth outlook, which gives you a sense of the obstacles, the headwinds that India faces, and why trade might just be the thing that breaks the headwinds. Second, what is India's untapped potential? And third, what are India's policy options for generating growth, but also another big debate in the region, employment. So let's start with the growth outlook. This is the global environment. We're very proud of this chart, but I know increasingly more people are showing this, especially the one on the left. The global economic environment has clearly become more challenging. I know you feel it in Europe, and we feel it in the US, and India feels it. So the left chart shows you just the global environment, what has happened to consensus forecasts over the last 5 months kind of thing. 12 months actually, since January a year ago. You can see how they've all sagged. Some have fallen off the cliff, others have sagged. The correction is particularly strong, of course, for the US and China, but for the Euro area also, where the weakness has been a bit more prolonged, it's deepening. The other thing, it's very obvious, is one of the contributors to these sagging growth forecasts globally is, of course, trade policy uncertainty. And that chart on the right has been much used. It's something, the trade policy uncertainty, at least in that data set, is very much concentrated on the US. But economic policy uncertainty, that's red line here in the chart, has also ticked up. Yes, it's not at historic highs, but it's getting there. So it goes beyond the US trade policy uncertainty. And that has implications even for India.
So we are
Now,
back basically to the COVID almost, right? The COVID period. In terms of
yeah, for the policy uncertainty, yes. For growth forecasts, no. I mean, obviously not. That is a risk that the global economy slides into a contraction, but it's not nowhere near the baseline. It's a kind of a tail risk. Now, for India, that means it will remain the fastest growing of the G20 economy, the large emerging markets. And that's what you see here in the chart on the left. This is not a new story. India already for many years, I mean, almost a decade now, it's been the fastest growing emerging market of the large emerging markets. That's the golden dots here in the left chart. And that will continue to be the case in India. But it is slowing and it's nowhere near where growth needs to be. And that's the point of the chart on the right. We don't, on the left, you can see that we're really not seeing much of a growth acceleration. So India may be doing better in other emerging markets, but it's not doing better than its own history. And it's not doing as well as it needs to in order to achieve its own Viksit Bharat goal. And that's the point of the chart on the right. India is one of the South Asian countries that has an explicit goal of reaching a higher income status. So for India, the goal is, I said it already, by 2047, they want to achieve high income status. And the chart on the right illustrates that. So currently it's growing around 6.5%. It needs to grow somewhere between 8 and 10% to actually achieve that. Really 8% every single year to achieve that. Now, one of the ways of achieving that, we hope, is trade. And the reason I'm saying that is history. Is since 1991, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, 29 countries have achieved what India is aiming to achieve, a jump from to high income status from either low or middle income status. Now, for many of them, we don't have data from 1991, but for the 17 of them for which we do have data, one pattern is very clear. They were all very open. On average, they had trade to GDP ratios of 85% of GDP, compared with those that did not make it of 62% of GDP. And the few that had lower, in this sample of 17 countries, the few that were not as open to trade, opened their doors wide. Yeah, on average, across all the ones who made it, their trade to GDP ratios rose by another 38 percentage points, and the lowest was a 13 percentage point increase. There was just very few exceptions to here, some oil producers that made it. So really, at least if you go by the historical record, the countries that did manage to jump to high income status were the ones that either were very open to begin with, or they really embraced trade. They really opened their doors. And the World Bank has written 2 World Development Reports of that. And for India specifically, our India Development Update last October also shows that what it could mean for India. So for India to achieve high income status without embracing trade, greater trade openness, it's not impossible. It would just be an outlier in the historical record. And India has actually started from a fairly favorable starting point, especially in the current environment. That's for 3 reasons. First, it relies on tariff-proof kinds of exports, services, no? Especially business services. So you see in the chart on the left here that 40% of Indian exports are actually services, a lot of business services. Business services are the single largest export industry, and it's hard to tax services. No, we all know that. There are other ways of disrupting them, but tariffs are hard to impose on services. And you can see that especially if you compare it to the other large emerging markets, like Brazil, for example, China, and the average emerging market and developing economy, other than these big 3 here in the left chart. All of them are much more reliant on goods exports than India. So India's starting point is good in having a reliance on kind of tariff-proof exports. And you can see that also in the center chart. Another illustration of these business services, somewhere between, well, it's the blue bar here. It's the largest part of exports. And compared with Brazil, where the largest part of exports, the single largest industry is agricultural exports. Compared with China, where it's electronics and machinery. Those are much more easily tariffed than what India is, India's main export industry. Other emerging markets as well. So that's by the type of exports, but it's also by the export markets, the countries, not the sectors, the countries that Indian exports go to. You can see that here in the chart on the right, the decomposition of goods and services exports by country, by destination country. Again, the blue bar, that's kind of diversification across countries. That's the share of exports that go to other emerging markets and developing economies. So you can see that India is by far the largest light blue bar, almost, well, around half, just over half of Indian exports go to other emerging markets, developing economies that are not China. Yeah, and China and the US are currently the ones at the heart of these trade tensions. China actually doesn't, India doesn't export as much as other countries to these two core countries. Where India exports is UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. It's really very well diversified, both in its sectoral structure and its destinations of exports. It's in a good position. And you can see that also in these kind of bespoke indicators we have here. The left chart shows you the standard deviation of export destinations. So if India traded with everyone equally, every country destination would have the same share, the standard deviation would be 0. Yeah. So a higher bar means a more concentrated set of export destinations. And you can see how low India is, especially in its goods exports. It really has very diversified destinations of goods exports. Services less so. These business services, especially, a lot of them are with the US. So it's more exposed to the US and is more concentrated in its services, business services exports. But at least in its goods exports, where all the high tariffs are, that's where India is very diversified. So that's by country in the left chart. We have the same thing by sector in the center chart. So again, you can see that in its goods concentration by sectors, India has a much lower standard deviation. So it's much less concentrated across sectors than, for example, Brazil, China, even the average other emerging market and developing economy. And the top 4 export sectors, refined oil, pharmaceuticals, metals, textiles, those are the top 4 on goods exports. They account for only 30% of goods exports, much less than for the others. So that's on the economics. A fairly diversified and tariff-proof set of exports. The politics too, that's the point of the chart on the right. The politics too are kind of middle of the road, fairly diversified. So now there's this geoeconomic fragmentation literature that has really taken off. And the measure they use for geopolitical stance, the geoeconomics literature that's now taken off, it's all about geopolitics seeping into economics, into bilateral ties. But it starts with geopolitics. It starts with a geopolitical stance. And that is measured usually in UN voting patterns. There is an indicator prepared by Bailey, Stretchner, and Voten that's become like the core of this literature. It measures how close is UN voting of every country to the US or to each other. And that you collapse all these UN votes into a single indicator of geopolitical stance. And you can see the distribution of these stances in the chart on the right. So for example, you see that red dashed line, it shows the number of emerging markets and developing economies that have a particular geopolitical stance. On the far right, by construction, is the US. And everyone else is kind of shifted relative to the US. So you can see that dashed red line, it has a bulge in this sort of on the leftish that says that most emerging markets and developing economies vote actually quite far from the US. And the dashed blue line shows that most advanced economies vote somewhere between that bulge of emerging markets and the US. China is a bit further than that bulge, the red bulge, so a bit further away from the US than most emerging markets. India is actually a bit closer to the US in its voting patterns than China is, or most emerging markets and developing economies are. So in general, so that to sort of summarize, both on the economic and on the political side, India is actually fairly well positioned in this current reshuffling of the global trade network. It's fairly well diversified. It's across both politics and economics. But here's the catch. It's just very close. It might be well diversified, but it's just very, very close. So you see export to GDP ratios here in the chart on the left. You see the bars for our South Asian countries, including India. This is the average export to GDP ratio in 2023, standard trade openness indicator. What the pink stripe shows you is the interquartile range of emerging markets and developing economies. So the fact that the blue bar for India now is below that pink stripe means that India is among the quarter of emerging markets and developing economies that are the least open in the world. It is one of the least open economies in the world, both on exports, whether you take exports of goods or exports of goods and services, both on exports and on FDI. On FDI, it barely makes it into the bottom quartile. No, it's just sort of around the threshold of the bottom quartile. It's just a very close economy, both on financial flows and on trade flows. And there are many reasons, and some of them are simply luck, but the others are policy. And that's what I want to show you here. I mean, some of them are just that it's a large country and the trade routes don't really go via India, they go elsewhere. That's luck, geography. But there is also policy, both on the trade side and on the FDI side, on the finance side. India's tariff, you see the same kind of chart here for tariffs, average tariffs, last data available, 2022. It's lagging. India's tariffs are among the highest in the world, among the highest in emerging markets, and top quartile of emerging markets and developing economies. It's just a high tax country, high tariff country. There's one president who has called it, one US president who has called it the king of tariffs. There is a reason. Tariffs are high. Tariffs are very high in India, much higher than elsewhere. And that impedes FDI as well. It impedes global value chain integration. And it's not just on the, most FDI comes in because typically FDI comes in because for export purposes, for export industries. No, and exports usually require imports as an input. So the three are really linked. Import tariffs, export market access, and FDI are really linked. So that already, even just the tariffs impede FDI. But on top of that, there are FDI restrictions. The OECD has this lovely new indicator, it's actually very granular on FDI, specific FDI restrictions. And they have some examples like screening and approvals, equity restrictions. Again, there are 50 emerging markets in that indicators. The blue range shows you the range for these 50 emerging markets. And then the golden dot shows you India. Again, India is in the top quartile by restrictions. It's just, it's a policy to restrict these external, both trade and FDI. Now, usually these, I mean, of course, we all know as economists, that's always a good thing to remove these restrictions because you get greater efficiency, greater prosperity. But often these restrictions are cut in the context of tariff agreements, free trade agreements. deeper ones, shallower ones, but usually in the context of agreements. And there, India is far behind its comparators. These charts show you the share of global GDP that is covered by the partners in free trade agreements. And you can see currently that the free trade agreements that India has with its partners is only 15% of global GDP. If it does come to an agreement with the EU and Canada and New Zealand, and also if that UK agreement is ratified, that would make a dramatic difference. It would raise almost threefold. It would triple its access, India's access to global GDP. That's a big deal. That makes a big difference and could massively improve opportunities for India. But currently, just for comparison, you have the Brazil and China. The equivalent data for Brazil and China, it's much less. India's is just much less. These 3 or 4 trade agreements are a fantastic opportunity. They would be an even better opportunity if they had a services component, a digital component, because remember that business services are India's biggest export sector. So if there were deep agreements, as they call them, that would bring even more benefits to India. Just to end, what can be one big debate is currently on GDP growth and trade opportunities, but the other big debate in India is on jobs. And what we would like to argue is that even for the jobs discussion, an opening to trade would be very beneficial for India. It could be the boost that India needs to job creation. And we're doing lots of work on this, but the bit we have started with is a simple literature review. This chart on the left shows a literature review. There's a big literature on trade and growth, trade and productivity. There's a very small literature on trade and jobs. 25 studies, and only 17 of them actually split it into short-term and long-term. And that's what we show you here. We just show you the share of studies that give a certain result. What comes out very clearly from this literature is that most studies, more than half, find that there's a benefit. Sorry, someone needs to mute. Most studies show that trade is associated with greater job creation. There are some studies, the red ones in this chart on the left, that show the opposite, and they have all one feature in common. What these studies have in common is that they look at subsets of jobs. They look at countries and communities and jobs and workers and households that cannot move. They cannot move across locations, or they cannot move across jobs, or they cannot move across sectors. So what comes out from the literature is trade does create aggregate employment, but there are groups that need to be helped to move. So this is the challenge with opening for trade. It can be a fantastic opportunity, but one needs to make sure that everything else can adjust. That there's enough flexibility in the system to move around and adjust. The other benefits, there are other collateral benefits to trade, and that's some of the other core challenges that have long been pointed out for India as well. And that's the chart on the right kind of shows you. It shows you the red bar for the average in other emerging markets, and it shows the blue columns for South Asia, and 70% of South Asia is India. The trade has been associated with greater productivity. Productivity is very, very low in South Asia. Labor productivity on average is about 1/20th, 5% of that in advanced economies. It's about a quarter of that in the average emerging market and developing economy. So labor productivity is extremely low in India and South Asia, and trade can just be the thing that gives that jolt to productivity. Employment ratios are low, that we talked about. Female employment ratios are extraordinarily low. They're in the bottom quartile of emerging markets and developing economies. And what the literature has very clearly shown, and we have shown in our previous reports, is that export industries tend to employ much more women. So that's another policy problem here. And finally, private investment. I'm sure you've all heard how weak private investment has been, and it's been a long-running concern for several years now in India and South Asia more broadly. Private investment ratios also tend to be higher at more trade open times and in more trade open countries. So the trade might just be the catalyst for addressing a lot of India's development challenges. So to summarize, growth prospects are dimming and are nowhere near enough to meet the goal of Viksit Bharat at the moment. So what is needed is a catalyst for growth acceleration. And trade might just be that catalyst, in part because it comes from such a low base. India is very well positioned, it's fairly diversified, both economically and politically, but it's just very closed. So just opening up, maybe the thing that stimulates, gives that boost to growth. And it can also help with all the other, or several of the other development challenges. What is needed, of course, is the tariff reductions and FDI restrictions.
We come back to the policies. Thank you, Francisca. During the discussion, thank you very much. Only a couple of minutes, but I knew your presentation was very focused and clean. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to hear Partha, that has maybe some different views. Again, I invite so the discussion maybe start from this different opinion. But please, again, I invite the participant to post their questions in the Q&A box. Partha, please.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Francisca, for a very focused presentation. And I think, my generation, those who grew up in a completely closed Indian economy, needed no discussion at all to point in the direction of opening up. So I will look at your 3 points because they are very well taken. So Daniela, next one. So you've talked about the environment, the global economic environment. You've talked about the fact that India's exports are service-based and that there's very little in terms of market share in the US and the Chinese markets. It's more diffuse. And the prescriptions you give is reduce tariff rates, increase FDI, and more FTAs. And, most of these things are unexceptionable because, as I will point out later on, that there's very little disagreement on this. But let me, if you like, place your sort of trade partial equilibrium. It is not quite partial equilibrium, but partial equilibrium analysis in the Indian context, make it a little more general equilibrium. And maybe some of the things will explain themselves, and maybe some more challenges would be thrown up. So let's, Daniela, next, please. Let's look at the Indian economy structure. Agriculture is very large in terms of employment. So this is, if you like, the reserve army of unemployed or underemployed in agriculture. 40-odd%, depending on how you count them, producing 14% or thereabouts of GDP. So it's really almost like Arthur Lewis's zero marginal productivity. Industry is where we should be going, and that's what you've also said. Yeah, the proportion of industry has been small and sticky. I mean, for 25 years, India has been trying to, since the Indian economy got liberalized, it wants to increase the share of industry, and it's not going up. Actually, it's shrinking. I mean, the shrinkage is not very significant, but deindustrialization is taking place before industrialization has taken place. So that's quite amazing. Now, one of the things which produces an insurmountable challenge is the fact that the Indian economy is pretty much bimodal in every sense. So in my presentation, I focused on this a little bit. So there is, if you look at health and education, which is where the state should be involved in, and there are people like me, my social class, we can compete with the best in the rest of the world. But if you go to the villages, and fifth standard students cannot do first standard sums. COVID has actually made a huge difference there. It's actually set things back. Similarly, health, health parameters, people talk about three parameters that, infant mortality, wasting, so infant mortality, India has done really well, because that's the first thing that attracts your attention. So you put all your resources into reducing infant mortality. But stunting and wasting, which requires large investment in in feeding children, in nutrition and things like that, India is actually below sub-Saharan Africa. So the supply effects of, if trade were to create demand, the supply effects could be a problem in the short and the medium run. So that's then, of course, you pointed out, and I fully agree with you that, if we have to move labor from agriculture, do we move them to services? You and I agree that services is already kind of overloaded, and so industry is where it should be, and the government also seems to agree. But should we be getting into microchips, or should we be getting into labor-intensive industry? There's no clarity on that. Daniela, next, please.
You have 5 minutes, Partha, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So here, the government of India's Make in India policy. So, after a long time, they've actually got something like an industrial policy. It has tried to attract FDI. So, some Japanese firms are there, Taiwanese firms are there. So, but there's no focus. It's not very clear whether they are trying to produce goods for export, or whether it is just to get certain production away from China. And there is just lack of clarity on that. How much investment should go into pharmaceuticals and textiles, and how much into chips, and assembling iPhones. We are not even talking about producing any of the ingredients. So there's no. So there's high tech versus labor intensive. There is this trade-off, and you are absolutely right that the tariff structure is, tariffs are not only high, but they are often inverted. So one of the things that people talk about, one sector where space has been vacated by China is textiles, and a lot of that should go into artificial, man-made fibers, rather than natural cotton. But at least two of the man-made fiber and industries are owned by big business houses who have more political clout than most others. So therefore, there's a political economy reason for the tariff structure being inverted. And that's hurting this labor-intensive sector very much. Next, please, Danielle. Now, here I come to more contentious issues, and I would disagree with some of your emphasis that openness. Are we talking about current account openness or capital account openness? Because it's are more open economies more successful than more closed economies? Yes and no. Depends on what you mean by openness. And if you compare as a bloc Latin American countries, again, there are differences there, and as a bloc in East Asia. So open economy has served East Asia really well, whereas open economy for over 100 years has not served Argentina that well. So it's not very clear that we are talking about openness as a package. So, and I just want to give you an example that, in India's openness in export terms is lower, but if you compare India and China, and this is last year's figures, India's export plus exports and imports as a share of GDP is 46%, and China is 37%. So India is way ahead of China. But look at the bilateral trade between India and China, again, last year's figures, approximately, because I had kind of memorized this. 113 billion was bilateral this thing. India's deficit was 100 billion. So, look at the amount of so India's been importing things from China and not exporting very much. So what is a possible reason? Is it, this is the bee in my bonnet, is it overvalued exchange rate? Possibly exchange rate changes from high tariffs and therefore do not afford protection to the industries that they need, that they are hoping to protect. So, macroeconomics trumps, not Donald Trump, trumps trade. So, East Asia grew via trade and current account surpluses. India is like some Latin American countries, which suffers from the Dutch disease. So my take on this is that India opened up its capital account. Large capital flows came in, and this is well documented. It's not. I'm not speculating here. It has caused a real appreciation, and that real appreciation caused large trade deficits. There were times when trade deficits were 8% of GDP. Now they are less. I mean, mainly because India has become an exporter of petroleum, and so we get petroleum and refine it. So if you ignore that, I think the industrial production is still very bad. Okay, last one, I think, Daniel, or is that it? So I agree with you that what you are giving very important policy prescriptions, Francesca. I have tried to locate some of the explanations in terms of India's underdevelopment and India's macroeconomics. And the macroeconomics is about getting the exchange rate wrong. And what seems to be completely missing in the Indian debate is that no one seems to be talking about it. So maybe we can have a discussion on this another time. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. Very well done. I think now we have food for discussion. So please post your questions in the Q&A. In the meanwhile, as the participants make up their mind, I make my question to both of you. That is that untapped potentials depends not only on the opportunities that India has, but also on what other countries, competitors, do to exploit their or develop their comparative advantages. So, and this is in somehow what Rajan was trying to do in his book, to see if, as other countries did develop a comparative advantage in industry, if it's not the case for India instead to develop services and in particular artificial intelligence. So I would be interested in knowing your views on this, both of you. Francisca, do you want to start? And also you can, of course, start to reply to Partha.
No, that's the thing. No, it's not like these. I think your point is extremely important. It doesn't really matter that much. Well, it doesn't only matter what India does. It matters whether the others are pulling ahead. And now with this reopening of all the global trade discussion, it may well be that the others pull far ahead And this, Pata, you're right. The industrial policy is a big policy effort now. I'd love to hear your views on whether you think it's successful. But it just may be overtaken by events or by other countries, to be precise. I also want to come in on the point about structural transformation that you made, Pata. You're right, that is the crux of the matter. So when we talk about India's lack of jobs, employment ratios falling when they're going up everywhere else, then it's really about the non-agricultural sector. Agricultural employment is sort of it's losing people just like everywhere else. That's fine, that's normal. What is not happening in India is that non-agriculture doesn't pick up. That's the bit that's missing. It's a non-agricultural sectoral weakness. And yes, maybe some of this can be encouraged by industrial policy, but perhaps there is another wheel on that cart that could work better, and that is simply removing frictions in the market so people can decide and find places to do and things to do. It's sort of decentralized. It becomes the economy working without the government being involved at all, just making it easy for people to move around. And that may be what's needed to raise non-agricultural output and employment, including exports.
Thank you, Francisca. Marta, you want to say?
Yeah. So very quickly, Sergio, that, if you take my intervention on India's labor force being bimodal, it is quite possible to have some high-end services and labor-intensive. So, I think what Francisca and I we are talking about is really trying to get the masses of the people going. We are not talking about the top end, because the top end is quite capable of taking care of themselves. They are also quite footloose. They can relocate to Europe and now probably not to the US, but they can relocate. So therefore, we don't need too much policy intervention. And India state, since it has not looked after the poor that well, has actually looked after the rich. All the IITs and things like that. So bimodal allows you some space to do both. Okay. The one other thing which I should have mentioned on what Francisca said, that Indian industrialization, if it takes place through trade, and it's going to be quite a nightmare, because the hinterland in India is where population is still growing. Growth rate might be in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar could be in excess of 1%. There, the local public good delivery is very poor. As things stand, all the jobs are in the coastal areas. Okay. Now, this is not different from China. I've done some empirical work on China also, where, there's the north-south divide. So south is the tradable, Shanghai near Hong Kong. So there is that. But here, the supply of, for the foreseeable future, the labor force is continuously going to grow in the north. And how much will the south absorb is... and we are starting from a situation of very poor environmental, the water quality is poor, air quality is poor. How much industry will we be able to? So these are challenges. I'm not saying that I have any answers.
Thank you. Marta, you want also to answer to what Francisca replied, or maybe later? We have a question. Oh, yeah.
No, I think we can discuss this, because I think there's quite a lot of agreement on that.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first one is from Mario. Do you think trade is the main factor of growth even now? That is not a locomotive. I mean, after years of very low level of trade. And also, if I can complement, knowing the person who raised the question, is when Francisca, you mentioned that since the early 90s, most countries, the successful stories of developing countries have been of opening. I think most of them are from probably from East Europe, and they benefited from the very peculiar and situation of being integrated in a strong institutional setting as the European Union. So, yeah, let's take into account also this, if it is true. Who wants to start answering the first question?
Well, India has, with a lot of fanfare, signed a free trade agreement with ASEAN. And now they are saying that it didn't work. Okay. So, therefore, why it didn't work, whether, it was destined not to work and now we are, but in terms of, it's probably, we need something like a big push, which could come from trade. But India is a continental shelf with all kinds of pulls and pressures. And that's why, even free trade agreements, there are all kinds of clauses to keep this sector out, that sector out, etc. So, if I were to answer this question, Mario's question, I think the problem is that, as a macroeconomist, you look back and you ask yourself that where is demand going to come from? Okay. And I'm talking about a sort of medium run perspective, not from the government. The private sector is also quite poor. So the foreign trade sector, with all the problems, as I said, that, there are environmental considerations, there are distributional considerations, is probably the only sector, if we manage it right.
Thank you,
Yes,
Pato.
I agree. Can I just come in on this too? I agree, Pata. I agree. And it's in part, I think it can be a locomotive of trade because it's coming from such a small base. Even a doubling of India's trade to GDP ratio would be something that would be hugely beneficial because there's this big tanker of a ship. And then there is this little bit of an export industry or open tradable industry in it. So it could make a big difference. But I also agree with you. It'll be much easier to digest a major opening to trade if it comes as other policies that just make it easier for people to adjust. No, your distributional environmental consequences that you talk about, and I think that goes into the second question here. It's true that the export industries, they don't only employ more women, they also employ more skilled people. It would be nice. I mean, India is vast. The population is vast, so there are a lot of skilled people already, But there's also a large army of unskilled people that Pata described as this reserve army. So if they had a bit of a leg up with better education, that doesn't need to take a generation. That can be just 2 years of English classes. No, this is something that's actually achievable. That can make all the difference to a lot of people and help them move around. So that'll help. I'm not sure it'll solve all the problems that would come, the political pressures that would come with a major opening of trade, because Pata already mentioned that these big conglomerates too that might come under threat. Let me stop there for now.
Thank you, Francisca. The part, I guess you, in a way, agree with the second question. I mean, to what extent do I agree with the second question that priority should be given to education, infrastructure, and health?
So, to the Indian government, infrastructure means building big roads. It's very North American style that, you must have huge trucks and people will get into their huge SUVs and drive 500 miles to visit their relatives. So, I think I also work on climate change. So, one of the things that India needs to do is to think more like Europeans do on transportation. Okay, so infrastructure has just run away with it. I mean, it is true that, Indian roads were very bad. Indian railways are still underfunded, but Indian roads have now caught up. Quality is a little iffy, but the railways are still. And for 200 kilometers, people are taking planes. That's not what you should be doing. So, infrastructure also has to be defined properly, physical infrastructure. But I'm talking about health and education. That is infrastructure in humans. And that I think the Indian government has not done anything about. The primary education, the state investment in primary education and health has been abysmal.
Thank you, Partha. Then we can move, if you agree, unless, Francisca, you want to say anything quick on this. Okay, so we can move to the third one, that is about the relationship between trade openness and education, income distribution, and poverty. Do you have an idea, any information, data on this? Who wants to start? Francisca, maybe?
So actually the bank has just published an update of the poverty numbers. And it is remarkable what has happened to poverty. It's fallen from double digits in the mid 2010s, early 2010s to something like 5% now. And that's with a new poverty line, global poverty line. So it's really remarkable what it has achieved. There's the Indian growth, even as a fairly closed economy. Other countries China has done it in a different way, different path. Also dramatically reduced poverty with an export-led growth. India has done it with a much more closed economy. It's really quite remarkable. But what strikes me every time I look at Indian exports is that the industry that is most successful, the business services industry, is the one that is, at least used to be when it started, least supported by government. It was the industry that was, it was business services. It sort of did everything on itself, on its own, because the government really didn't focus much on it. There wasn't heavy regulation of labor thing. All the labor regulation focused on manufacturing. So this industry kind of grew up in the shadows and became incredibly productive. So sometimes one wonders whether the best policy might not be less government rather than more government. But when unleashed, the Indian private sector is just a remarkable thing.
Thank you. Partha?
Yeah, I agree that, since 1990s, the old business houses have more or less disappeared, and there is some new energy in business. And if you look at the effects of CBAM on India's steel sector, the big steel firms are all that came into existence in the 70s and the 80s. So they are not sort of 100-year-old firms. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, I think it is not really government versus private sector. I agree that, there's a huge government failure, but government should not be doing things that it is doing. Government should be trying to manage public health, public education, and provide an enabling environment. Whereas what it does is it often gets into production, and then there are loss-making things and bailing out conglomerates who have a hotline to the government. So I think, but that's well known. I don't have to say that again.
Thank you. I don't know if there are other questions. Please pause it. Otherwise, I can give the last round of final thoughts to the two speakers. Yeah, Daniele, please. Do you have any question? No.
No. Thank you.
Okay, so let's have the last thoughts of this discussion. Very interesting, with different positions, but also a lot of agreements. Maybe Partha, you start.
Yes, I think that, this is anecdotal, but I think this is true across regions, that if you look at what are the industries that China displaced in its rise, a lot of them are wherein there are increasing returns to scale. I mean, I'm thinking of what industries died in India. So there are things like bicycles and air conditioners and things like that, which, given India's scale, there was no hope of competing against China. So those industries died. But and this brings me back to my point about the Dutch disease, that there are lots of things where which are very transport cost intensive, which are heavy, and there are no scale economies. So if you bear with me, one of my favorite examples is Ganesh. Ganesh is the elephant god who's worshipped in the month of October in India. The Ganesh statues are all produced in China now. Now, but why? So it must be, I doubt that it's comparative advantage. It must be absolute advantage. So therefore the Chinese, but people tell me that who go for pilgrimage to Mecca, that all the knickknacks in Mecca are also produced by China now. But I'm talking. So there are lots of things that China has taken away from us, from India, because of, I think, misaligned exchange rates. And it is easy to claw some of them back, okay? Because that's not where China's quote-unquote comparative advantage is. The problem is beyond that, which is what Francisca has been emphasizing, that, can we get onto the global bandwagon and pull people out of poverty? And I wish we could, yes, but that's something that we need to talk about. But there are, if you like, low-hanging fruits, and there are fruits which are way up there. So
thank you, Partha. So the last words to Francisca, and thank you again, Francisca, for joining us.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Patan. It's a pleasure. So this is, for me, this is a really exciting moment of opportunity, because all the global trade landscape is being reopened. And this is the opportunity. I think most people in the government know, most people in India know, it needs greater opportunities, it needs greater openness. This is the moment to lock it in. And if I may pick up on what Pata said, I could easily imagine in India that imports all the statues, the little Ganesh statues from China. Actually, the world imports Ganesh statues from China. Even the Christian statues are probably all from China. That's fine. And then have double down on trade in electronics or in business services. This is the moment. But I fear that the moment will pass and India will just be left behind if it doesn't open now, both trade and FDI.
Okay, thank you, Francesca. Francisca, very, very interesting. Thank you, Partha. Thank you, everybody joined. We continue the discussion. We probably next one will be on the next webinar on the free trade agreement between EU and India. So it is a discussion, and then we also hope to discuss other issues in our series of webinar. You are always welcome. And thank you. Have a nice afternoon and a nice evening, or wherever you are. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Daniele.
Thank you. Bye.